Welcome back in. Welcome back in. So, before we get started, I do just want to say really quickly, I appreciate all the support we've gotten this year, and I hope everybody has a wonderful and great Christmas this weekend. Hope everybody gets a win under the tree for them to head into the fantasy championships next week. So, let's go ahead and get right into our week 16 RB1s. Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler, Josh Jacobs, Saquon Barkley, Dalvin Cook, Ramondre Stevenson, Nick Chubb, Tony Pollard, Miles Sanders, Aaron Jones, and Kenneth Walker. So let's get into a couple of these running backs. I do just want to hit on Miles Sanders really quickly. It looks like Jalen Hurts is going to miss this week with a shoulder injury, which is good news for Miles Sanders. It takes away that component to the Eagles where Jalen Hurts takes away a lot of his value, especially on the goal line. So Miles Sanders should be a pretty decent play against the Dallas Cowboys, who have struggled a little bit in recent weeks against the running back. We just saw Travis Etienne get back on track against them, rush for over 100 yards. So I do think Miles Sanders sets up to be in a pretty good spot this week against the Dallas Cowboys. So I think you can trust him this week more so than what you can on a week to week basis. And then let's go in and jump into Kenneth Walker. He was okay last week, playing 75% of the snaps. He had 12 carries. Now he did see a season high 28 pass routes, which is the most he's ran all year. He also had 5 targets, which was the second most he's seen all year. This could be a trend for him, especially with Tyler Lockett looking like he's going to miss some time with this broken finger. And what he does best is, these breakaway runs, explosive rushes. He is 5th in the league in breakaway run rate. Now, the Chiefs rank 14th and explosive rush rate on the year, just carries of 10 or more yards. So I think this is a good spot for Kenneth Walker this week. Handles 61% of the opportunities, 7.8% target share in this offense, averaging about 13.5 fantasy points per game. He is 31st in yards per out run, but he's 6th in yards created per touch as well. So I do think he sets up more as a back end RB1, mainly because the Chiefs have been good against the run. They rank 18th in rush DVOA. However, they are 22nd since week 4. They do allow the 6th fewest yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points to running back. So let's keep it moving here and jump over to our RB2s. And they are as follows: Alvin Kamara, Joe Mixon, Najee Harris, Travis Etienne, J.K. Dobbins, Raheem Mostert, Jerick McKinnon, Ezekiel Elliott, James Conner, Isaiah Pacheco, Rashad White, Zonovan Knight wraps up that list. So let's jump into some of these guys. Let's talk about Alvin Kamara and Joe Mixon. Firstly, I want to mention Alvin Kamara, who just this hasn't been his year. It has not been good for him this year. He's only averaging 14.3 fantasy points per game, which is well below what he normally averages in a season. He is handling 77% of the opportunities, 13.7 carries, and 5.8 targets per game. He still only has 3 touchdowns in the year, which he scored all in one game. That has really lowered his ceiling this year. And so Alvin Kamara, last week without Mark Ingram, he handled 20 plus touches in that game. But it's been frustrating if you own him because he's just not scoring any touchdowns at all, which is limiting his ceiling. So this is a great matchup against Cleveland, who ranked 30th on rush DVOA. They'll have the 6th most rushing yards, 3rd most touchdowns, and the 6th most fantasy points to running backs. Really good spot, but he's harder to trust because he's Taysom Hill is taking away goal line rushes. We're just not seeing Alvin Kamara score touchdowns at a very high rate at all. So it's just been frustrating with Alvin Kamara. So I did want to mention him. That's why we have him at RB13, despite being in a really, really good spot this week against Cleveland. Next up, let's talk about Joe Mixon. And I know there's going to be somebody in the comments section, Joe Mixon's way too low, bro, way too low. But pump your brakes, because this is a very bad matchup against the New England Patriots. They are 9th in rush DVOA. They'll have the 7th fewest rushing yards, the fewest touchdowns. They've only allowed 3 rushing touchdowns on the season to opposing running backs, and the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. And Joe Mixon has not been very efficient this year. He is 40th in yards created per touch, 45th in breakaway run rate on the year. And since the 2 weeks returning from injury, he's only handling 60% of the snaps, which is down from his season averages. And he's only averaging 12.5 carries, which is down from the 15.3 carries per game he normally sees, 3.5 receptions, 80 total yards. And another problem, 5 of his 8 touchdowns all came in that week 9 game where he went absolutely nuclear. So that means he has failed to score a touchdown in 8 of 12 weeks this year. So Joe Mixon, I think, is harder to trust on a week-to-week basis. What raises his floor, though, is his pass catching involvement, averaging 5 targets per game. And so he's been heavily involved there. Almost 20 targets over the last couple of weeks as well. But so I think he has a nice floor, but his ceiling is not that high. It gets a really, really good run defense of the Patriots. So I did want to touch on him. Let's keep it moving here and let's talk about the rest of these guys. Najee Harris this week sets up to be in a really good matchup against the Raiders. The Raiders allowed the most fantasy points to running backs. They are 21st in rush DVOA. He's averaging 15.1 carries, 2.9 targets. So the volume is definitely there. Just not a very good offense, only averaging 12.4 fantasy points per game. He does have 8 touchdowns, which is good. good. He is 31st in yards per out run, but 48th in yards created per touch, which is terrible, and ninth in evaded tackles. So Najee Harris, pretty decent floor, not a great ceiling. This is kind of who he's been all year. Not the guy you drafted him to be, but he's still providing decent fantasy production for you. So don't mind him this week against the Raiders. Next up, let's talk about this Chiefs backfield. You have Jerick McKinnon and Isaiah Pacheco. I have both of them as top 24 options this week. Since week 12, Isaiah Pacheco is averaging 16 carries, 72 rushing yards per game, but only 1.75 receptions and 16.75 receiving yards per game and 2 total touchdowns. And he's averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game. Where you have Jerick McKinnon, who has been the pass catching running back, who's averaging 6 carries per game, 31 rushing yards, 54.5 receiving yards, and 5 total touchdowns for 20.8 fantasy points per game. Jerick McKinnon has been the preferred option on passing downs, and he's also the preferred option inside the red zone. So that makes Jerick McKinnon a little bit more valuable than Isaiah Pacheco. This is a really good matchup against Seattle, who ranked 28th in rush DVOA. They have the fourth most rushing yards, second most touchdowns, and fantasy points. They also allow the fourth most receiving yards and the 10th most receiving touchdowns to opposing running backs. So both these guys are in really good spots here. We keep talking about game script for Isaiah Pacheco being in his favor. Just really hasn't been that way. You look at the Texans last week; they played them very closely last week. The Broncos did the same thing. The Chiefs just have not been putting teams away and allowing teams to stay in it, which makes Jerick McKinnon a pretty solid play. He's scored 30 plus fantasy points each of the last 2 weeks. I do not expect that to move forward. Understand that a lot of his usage comes through the passing game. So PPR formats, Jerick McKinnon is a great option, a really solid flex option this week. Overall, I think both of them are in play. I think Isaiah Pacheco is much more of the boom or bust type option. If he doesn't score a touchdown, it's not going to be as great. I would rather play Jerick McKinnon if I had a choice. But I think either one of them are both useful flex options this week. So let's keep it moving here. Let's talk about J.K. Dobbins against Atlanta. Since returning from his injury, he's handling 41% of the snaps, 14 carries, 124 total yards. He has scored 1 touchdown in those 2 games, 15.9 fantasy points per game. This is a decent matchup against Atlanta. They're 26th in rush DVOA. They'll have the 11th most yards, 15th most touchdowns, but the 12th fewest fantasy points. That's because they've done a pretty good job of limiting running backs through the air, which we don't have to worry about that with J.K. Dobbins because that's not what J.K. Dobbins is going to do. He's only run 9 total routes on the year. So I do think J.K. Dobbins against Atlanta, it's a pretty good spot. We're not worried about game script. They're going to be able to keep this one close. So J.K. Dobbins, who has been pretty good so far since returning. Next up, let's talk about Raheem Mostert. Really good matchup this week against Green Bay. Raheem Mostert, 11.8 carries per game, 60% of the opportunities, 2.2 targets, 7% target share in this offense, but he's only averaging 10.2 fantasy points per game. Last week, without Jeff Wilson, he handled 75% of the snaps. He had 156 total yards. This week is a really good spot against Green Bay, who are 32nd in rush DVOA. They'll have the 5th most rushing yards, 14th most touchdowns, and the 7th most fantasy points to running backs. So even if Jeff Wilson does return, I still think he's not going to play 75% of the snaps, but he's still going to see a pretty healthy touch share. So really good matchup against Green Bay. If Jeff Wilson returns, he probably drops a little bit more of a low end RB2, but I still think he's definitely in play against the Packers. Lastly, let's talk about Zonovan Knight against the Jacksonville Jaguars on Thursday Night Football. Last week was not good at all for Zonovan Knight, but we have seen the Lions do a really good job against opposing running backs, especially in recent weeks. This week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Jaguars rank 14th in rush DVOA. They'll have the 13th fewest rushing yards, but the 10th most touchdowns and then 19th most fantasy points to running backs. However, some of that is a little bit skewed because they did a really good job early in the season, but over the last 4 games, we have seen them allow 130 or more rushing yards over that span. So I do think Zonovan Knight is going to be in play this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. I know people that played him last week are not happy, are probably going to want to avoid him. Depends on your option if you can sit him or not. But overall, this is a really good matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars for Zonovan Knight. There was a little bit of an ankle injury scare. He was not even on the injury report whatsoever on Monday. So I think that's good news for Zonovan Knight on Thursday Night Football. Lastly, let's jump over a couple of these RB3s that I want to hit on. DeAndre Swift continues to be a very volatile asset. Last week saw 9 targets. He only had 8 carries, but he did have 75 total yards and 5 receptions. No touchdowns for him last week, but he did score 12.5 fantasy points. Not great, obviously, considering you drafted him with probably a top 3 rounds of your draft. He is not providing that at all. But I do think if game script depends on it, I think DeAndre Swift is still a decent flex option. That's where we're at with him. Next up, let's hit on Tyler Algier versus Baltimore. He played 48% of the snaps last week, 17 carries, 136 total yards, a touchdown, and 22.6 PPR points, which made him an RB8 overall last week. Now, this is not a good matchup against Baltimore. He is 6th in rush DVOA. They're first over the last 4 weeks, and they'll have the 7th fewest fantasy points to running backs. But Last week was also not a good matchup against the New Orleans Saints either, and he came through. But Baltimore is a much better run defense than what New Orleans brings to the table. I know people are going to look at that and be like, man, I wish I would have played him last week. And maybe they're looking to play him this week. I don't know if I would trust him against Baltimore. I like Tyler Algier. It is good news that Caleb Huntley went to the IR. So it really kind of consolidates things a little bit between him and Cordell Patterson. But this just is a really bad matchup. So I did want to mention that with Tyler Algier if people really want to fire him up after that really big production game that he had last week against the New Orleans Saints. So other than that, I think there are a few other guys. I think that I would rather play Deion Jackson over Zach Moss. Jonathan Taylor got sent to IR. Deion Jackson's the guy that I would want to play. He is the pass catching back here in this backfield. I do think guys like Brian Robinson and Cam Akers should have lowered expectations this week. Brian Robinson gets one of the worst matchups you possibly can get against the 49ers. He's not really utilized in the passing game, so I would probably look to avoid playing him. I think the Buffalo situation here is an interesting one. I think Devin Singletary and James Cook are both, kind of RB3s this week against a really bad Chicago Bears defense, but neither one of them really stand out. They kind of cannibalize each other a little bit. And with Josh Allen also taking away rushing opportunities, it kind of makes them hard to trust. I would probably prefer James Cook just because he's the pass catching option here versus Devin Singletary, but it is a really good matchup for both of them as well. So that being said, I appreciate everybody checking out the video. Hope everybody has a happy holidays. We will see you on the next one. Bye.